Myrtle Beach are we talking about? And are we talking about as the crow flies, or are we talking across paved roads? If we tell you there are going to be amenities present, then we need to tell you when they're going to be ready and things like that. Close to shopping, how close to shopping? Are we going to require people to build, or are we just basically selling swampland where no one's ever going to build? Full disclosure, okay? So the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act, if I were you and I were studying this, I would really focus on this. The sale of land across state line, typically sight unseen. The sale of land across state lines, typically sight unseen. Notice that key part, typically sight unseen. You know, this is where the marketing and the high pressure sales really come in. Blake, you said you saw Glengarry Glen Ross. Do you remember the scene where Al Pacino is the top salesperson in the company, and he's trying to avoid this guy. He's trying to avoid this guy's phone call for a period of time. He's basically sold this guy a lot in one of these subdivisions. The guy's wife finds out about it. She wants the money back or whatever. Well, Pacino's trying to avoid him for a few days, and the reason he's trying to avoid him for a few days is the buyer has a right to rescind within a certain period of time. So if he can avoid them past the rescission period, then he gets paid, he gets the commission on that particular sale. It's also, if you've ever heard the people talk about always be, the ABCs of selling, always be closing, that's a famous scene in that movie. And then my favorite scene in the movie is, I'm not a huge Alec Baldwin fan, but he's awesome in this movie. He's a sales manager in this movie. And this is their contest. They get these leads, and it's your job to try to close the highest percentage, as high a percentage of the leads as you can, because the leads cost the company money, and it's your job to go out and close them. And he's a sales manager, and this is the way his sales meetings go. See if you'd like this sales meeting. They're having a sales contest, and he says, the winner of the sales contest is my new Cadillac. New Cadillac, leather interior, all the upgrades or whatever. You win, you get my Cadillac. Second prize, you get this set of steak knives. Third prize, you're fired. My kind of sales meeting right there. At least you know where you stand. At least you know where you stand. It's a great movie. Don't watch it with the kids. By the way, look at the first bullet point up there. 25 or more lots. I'm not too worried about you memorizing the exact number, but you do understand if you're going to scam somebody, at least do it with enough lots that it makes sense. If you only have one lot to sell, you're exempt from this act, but we're not really worried about you running a major scam if you only have one lot to sell. Moving on, building codes. Remind yourself of the name of the chapter that we are in. Was it land use controls? But now we're talking about building codes. So how is a building code a land use control? It's actually not, except for one thing. If I went to build a 4-unit apartment building on the property that I own a lot in a single-family residential subdivision. Will I ever get a permit to build a quad? I just won't get a permit. They would not allow me to build a quad. So from that standpoint, building codes are in fact land use controls. Having said that, building codes actually deal with the safety of structures, don't they? Safety of structures. How does the building code affect safety of structures? There is a statewide building code. It's actually enforced locally, but it's a statewide building code. Your local municipality can be more strict than the building code. They cannot be less strict than the building code. And of course, it's going to deal with safety of the functions of the house. For example, the framing is going to need to be inspected. The HVAC, that's going to need to be inspected before you finish. The plumbing, the wiring, all these things have to be inspected. And ultimately, one of the things I would like you to have in relation to building codes is the concept of a CO. CO stands for Certificate of Occupancy. At the end of going through these multiple inspections and passing these multiple inspections, you'll have to pass a final inspection and get your Certificate of Occupancy, which allows you permanent use of the property. Up until that time, you might be working off of a temporary electrical or something to that effect. Certificate of occupancy means you've passed the inspections and you can now finally use it for its intended purpose. Okay, building code. Now notice the slide right here. I'm just going to read you what it says, and clearly you can go back and do this as well. Weirdly enough, this is a problem topic on the exam, that people confuse building codes with zoning ordinances, and I think it's just because you read it too quickly. Slow yourself down on here. Building codes are construction standards, right? I mean, they deal with the building. Zoning regulations regulate land use. The only way that building codes come in regards to land use is the permitting situation I described to you just a moment ago. Do you see where we're going with that? And then finally, we should be getting, well, no, no. I thought we were getting close to wrapping up this chapter. Still talking about public restrictions on land. We talk about flood hazard areas. There are going to be restrictions on what you can do in flood hazard areas. Does that make sense? Actually, flood hazard areas work almost like an overlay. You already have restrictions on that area, but now if you're in a flood hazard zone, there are going to be further restrictions on top of that as well. Who draws the hazard areas? FEMA. They're designated by FEMA. FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, right? If you would like to look up some of these flood hazard areas, you can look on FEMA.gov, or you can look at ncfloodmaps.com, or you can go to your local municipality and they likely would have the updated, most recent maps. Do flood hazard areas ever change?
Yes.
Clearly they do. They change on a fairly regular basis, especially in areas like ours where we're developing so much and it affects water runoff. Flood hazard areas, they work as a restriction on land use. FEMA draws the maps. You have various ways of looking them up. Can you buy property in a flood hazard area?
Yes.
Yes. But if you have a federally related mortgage, you have to have what? Flood insurance. It's a separate type of insurance. Flood insurance is actually defined as water rising from the ground, as opposed to water being driven by wind or something like that. It's very specific about what it covers you for. The flood program is actually a national program. You may see it sometimes, NFIP, National Flood Insurance Program, but you can buy the policy through your local agents, but it is a nationally supported program. And then you see on the last bullet point there, how could you uncover these flood hazard areas? Well, do a survey. Recommend a survey. As an agent, you're not doing a survey. Recommend a survey. Now we're almost through with the public restrictions. This is the last one. Highway access controls. Highway access controls. I just turn around and see the red star there. Brokers must disclose material facts about road access. Think about the conversation we had earlier talking about easements. I think ingress and egress is something that the buyer absolutely would be interested in. From that standpoint, it is a material fact. The ability to access the property affects the value of the property. Highway access controls. Let me go back to my subdivision again just real quickly. My subdivision is off of Avon Ferry Road. It has become a very busy subdivision. Okay? What if a developer bought a piece of property, developer purchases a tract of land that has a lot of road frontage against Avon Ferry Road. Now, think about this for just a second. The cheapest way to develop a subdivision is just to create lots right here with driveways going out to there. You see any problem with putting 38 driveways on Avon Ferry Road? That's going to be dangerous for everybody, right? Dangerous for traffic, dangerous for homeowners. What do you normally see in a subdivision? Yeah. Don't you see an entrance in our subdivision that looks like this? We have ingress and egress at two different points. We have interior roads. These houses face interior roads, okay? And that way there's only one or 2 points that you can come out on Avon Ferry Road. It's designed for safety. That's the significance of highway access controls. Makes sense? And you see why it's a legitimate use of the police powers of the state. Interestingly enough, this area right here along the frontage is actually condemned. It's condemned for a right-of-way easement. In most cases, you literally can't put a building there. In some cases, you can't put even shrubbery or swells there because there might be issues of sight lines and things like that. So that's all done for the health, safety, welfare of people living and riding down that road. Highway access restrictions. That sound good? Okay. I am finished with public restrictions, but do you remember how I started this chapter? Public land use controls versus private land use controls. So now all we have left to talk about are the private land use controls, which I said would basically be a category of one. These are your deed restrictions. Now I want you to think about this. Now I know it's getting late. What time is it? 2:16. 2:16. Do you see how you feel right now? Y'all did good right before lunch. Came back from lunch a little bit soft again. We're going to have to work on that. The day of the test, did I tell you that this is a 4-hour test? I will start you at 10 o'clock the day of the test. Some of you will still be here right up till 2 o'clock. You won't be here at 2:01 because if you are, I literally have to take your test from you. But do you see how you feel right now? This low energy web that you have right now. Make sure you get used to that. You'll find out a lot of words in this class. They start to look very similar or sound very similar when you're tired. Okay. So as we get closer and closer to the exam, is the exam date on Monday? We need to change that because y'all are different. Or maybe it won't be following the Oscars or anything important, so you'll sleep well the night before. Maybe we'll have some wine to get us more comfortable, right, Ann? You'll be our supplier of that. What's that?
Some 10 a.m. wine.
Some 10 a.m. wine. Have they 10 a.m. wine? You know what they call 10 a.m. wine? Wine. See, that's what I'm talking about. Private land use controls. Let's go ahead and get started. We're almost done before today. Realistically, we're talking deed restrictions, restrictive covenants. And for the most part, what I want you to think about is in regards to private land use controls, this is an agreement you have with another private party or with a bunch of people. For example, my subdivision, my restrictive covenants, they cover 900 homes. I've already mentioned that. They don't cover anybody else, but it does cover the 900 homes in our subdivision. And interestingly enough, restrictive covenants must be recorded to be enforceable, right? You understand you just can't make up stuff and start enforcing it. They have to be recorded to be enforceable. So the question I'm going to ask you is, since this is a private restriction, not public, who's going to enforce these restrictive covenants? Who is going to enforce restrictive covenants? Who created them? Before the HOA even existed, who created them? The developer created the restrictive covenants at the time that they were creating the subdivision, right? So the developer actually will enforce them while the developer's there. Hopefully the developer will eventually leave. They'll finish the subdivision and leave. In which case, who else can enforce the restrictive covenants? The HOA, the homeowners association. Okay? So the developer, the homeowner association, but here comes an interesting point. Who else can enforce the restrictive covenants? Who'd you say?
Your neighbors.
The crazy neighbors. The crazy neighbors can. Any individual who is held accountable to the restrictive covenants can actually hold someone else accountable to the restrictive covenants. Now, I'm not talking about go and punch somebody in the nose because they have a flat tire on the car in front of their house. I mean, granted, it would be great if the developer would take care of it, or the HOA would take care of it, but in some of these cases, there's not an active HOA. You might, in fact, have to enforce against someone in the neighborhood. So let's take a look at that real quickly. Because of the size of my neighborhood, often when I'm out walking, I may be still in my neighborhood, yet 1.5 miles away from my house. There's a guy on the back of the property that he has a dog that he keeps tied to a tree in the backyard. That dog barks and poops, runs the grass out and stuff. It's nasty. Okay, this is not a true story. Don't anybody go looking for me. Okay, I'm just making this up. Sort of. But anyway, He is nowhere near my property, right? He's a mile and a half away from my property. But can I enforce against him? Why can I enforce against him?
Because you are held accountable as well as he is.
Bingo. I'm held accountable to the same covenants, so we can't enforce against each other. I prefer it if a third party does it, but if necessary, I can do it. Listen to this word. How can a private individual enforce against someone who is violating the restrictive covenants? And here's the answer. I can go to court to seek an injunction. Do you remember that word coming up from earlier? Injunction, a cease and desist order. I can actually, even though this is a private restriction, I can use the courts to enforce it, just like any civil lawsuit, actually. I can go to court and seek an injunction. Now, I know it's late, but I need you to make a connection right here. Do you remember earlier today that I said an injunction could be used to stop an illegal use? And now I'm telling you an injunction can be used to stop a restrictive covenant, someone who's violating a restrictive covenant. The difference is who brings the case. If it's a violation of a public restriction like an illegal use, who's going to bring the case? It's a city inspector, a zoning enforcement. It's going to be some city official that's going to do it, right? Public official. But if it's a violation of a restrictive covenant, who's going to bring the case? It's going to be a private citizen or a private entity like the homeowners association. Did you make that connection? Amanda, you were looking at me. Did you make that connection? Good, because it's important that you understand that. If I were writing a test question, I'd try to trick you into making you think that a public official enforces restrictive covenants. But that's not true. It's not the case. Does it make sense? Okay, perfect. Now we have another dilemma. In regards to these restrictive covenants, can you give me an example of the type of thing that your restrictive covenants might cover? How about? Well, you can go first.
Holiday lights.
Holiday lights. Sound like that's a little sensitive. You still have your Christmas lights on? Okay, just checking. Broken down cars near the property. Fences, certainly. Paint colors. You guys are picking some great ones, and let me tell you why you're picking some great ones. What I wanted you to look at was the difference between what the city might restrict in regards to zoning versus what restrictive covenants. Do you think the city cares if you leave your Christmas lights up all year long? They don't typically. Now, they might care about cars, but maybe not as much as the covenants would. And in regards to fences, I don't think the city cares what your fence height is or whether they're scallop ears or anything like that. But your restrictive covenants do. How about home size? What does the city care about in regards to your home size, the city or the county, depending on where you are? The zoning and your setbacks. They don't care. If you can get it on the property within the setbacks, there might be impervious surface restrictions as well. But beyond that, they really don't care how big your house is. But your HOA, your restrictive covenants, what might they tell you in regards to home size? No, it could. I mean, could for vistas or something like that. But what else?
It should be the same as the rest of them.
Same architectural style, and also, say again?
Square footage regulations.
Square footage. They might put minimum sizes. Your HOA probably put minimum sizes for you to build within the neighborhood because they're trying to hold everybody's property values up. So be aware of the difference between what zoning might cover and what restrictive covenants might cover, public versus private. But here's the final point that's important on that. This is always going to be the case, by the way. In the event of a dispute, between zoning and restricted covenants, in the event that there's a conflict between zoning and restricted covenants, which one will rule? It seems like zoning would be the answer, doesn't it? But that's not correct. It's not correct.
But it would have been established before the covenants.
Probably so. Yeah, zoning would have been there first.
So since it's after the fact, that's why I think that.
No, you hadn't got it yet. So if it's not zoning, what's the answer? Well, it's not restricted covenants either. Is that trick, Jim? It depends, but this one, it actually has a specific answer. In the event of a conflict between zoning and restrictive covenants, the most restrictive will rule. The most restrictive will rule. After you write it down and think about it, it becomes kind of obvious to you, okay? The restrictive covenants will never let you out of any zoning, okay? But the restrictive covenants can be more strict, like that fence we're talking about. City doesn't care, but restrictive covenants may say it has to be a certain material, a certain height, a certain scallop on the boards or something like that, okay? The most restrictive will rule. That's actually going to be a theme you'll see throughout the class. When in doubt, when there's a conflict between two, just go with the most restrictive.
So like our covenants, we're trying to limit parking on what's considered to be public streets. So there's a lot of argument in our neighborhood about who's right and what they can afford.
Yeah. Yeah, that's always the case with our covenants. I assume y'all sought legal advice on that. You know, parking's always a big deal, but the problem is, remember the conversations we've had today. Within your subdivision, there are public streets, right? Don't start going and towing cars just because you don't want to park there, because if it's on a public street, they may have every right to park on that street. Now, if you went and towed them and tore their front fender off, your HOAs would end up paying somebody an insane amount of money. And this is very controversial. We get into arguments about it all the time. And so you probably need to seek legal advice on something as petty as that. You know what our HOA, we're getting ready to have an HOA meeting soon. I can promise you right now what we're going to spend the first 45 minutes talking about. You know what we're going to spend the first 45 minutes of our important HOA meeting talking about? What's that? It usually comes up sometime in March. Dog poop. We're going to talk about dog poop. 45 minutes of talking about dog poop in our HOA meeting. 3 minutes on the budget. 45 minutes on dog poop. Those poop stations weren't nice until they put one directly behind our house, and those things stink, so we moved somewhere else. Let's see. Imposed and enforced by individual property owners. I think we said that. You feel okay? This is interesting. It applies only to the subdivision identified, not all surrounding subdivisions. You remember the story I told earlier today about the problem with private restrictions? They can only restrict the ones that are in that particular subdivision, okay? So that's an interesting point. It's appurtenant, it runs with the land. Every once in a while you'll have to deal with this, where you'll get a buyer who will say something like this: I need a place to park my boat. Well, I'm selling you a house in a subdivision in Cary, North Carolina. Here's what I can promise you. You're not parking it outside, okay? Oh, I'll just do it. I'll get that covenant changed. No, you ain't. And you know what it would take to change that covenant? I mean, a near unanimous vote to change most of these covenants. You need to be prepared to learn to live with the covenants if you're going to live here, okay? Enforcement generally transferred to HOA from the developer. We talked about that, and it can't be for anything that's illegal. Obviously, you can't have a enforceable covenant to do an illegal thing. Make sense? Responsibility of real estate agents. You should be aware of land use controls. You can help your buyers identify some of these land use controls. And as I mentioned several times today, realistically, we're talking red flags for agents. Did you hear something that led you to believe that there might be a concern? Okay, if so, let's help your buyers check it out. To be quite honest with you, you don't always have to have the answer. Sometimes you can be the source of the information. You want to put a home-based business here? We need to go downtown and talk to somebody with the city about whether that's going to be allowed or not. We need to write the contract contingent upon you getting the use that you want. That's what agents can do. Verify that the buyer consumer's end use will be allowed. Do not interpret land use controls. Consult with an attorney. Okay? All that makes sense? Let's see how you do with these. I'll finish with chapter 6. Government regulates all of the following except. What's the key word here? The who? The government regulates all the following except. Creation of subdivisions, yes or no?
Yes.
The building codes, yes or no?
Yes.
Subdivision regulations. Yes, that's the one I was trying to trick you with, but you didn't fall for it because you knew the correct answer was restrictive covenants, because those are private restrictions. Key terms, did you understand that I think that street disclosure laws are important? Okay, clearly. Police powers just simply means the powers of the municipality. It has nothing to do with police. It has to do with the powers of the municipality. Variance you're familiar with at this point, non-conforming use, spot zoning, interstate land sales full disclosure act. I am done with chapter 6, which brings me to this. We are running about 45